March 20th, 1905. Brockton, Massachusetts. The factory does not catch fire first. It explodes. At a few minutes before 8 in the morning, the R.B. Grover Shoe Factory is already alive with the ordinary sounds of industrial labor. Belts move, machines wait under tension, boots strike wooden floors. Men and women settle into the first minutes of the day, carrying lunch pails, adjusting aprons, taking their places beside stitching machines and cutting benches. The air is cool outside, but inside the building the heat system is already working, fed by steam pressure below. Nothing in the rooms above announces what is building underneath them. There is no long warning, no orderly evacuation, no time to understand. Then the boiler gives way. The blast tears upward with such force that the building seems to jump from its own foundations. Brick, timber, iron, glass, and steam erupt together. Floors collapse almost instantly, dropping one onto another until whole levels are crushed into narrow layers of wreckage. Machines break loose and fall with the beams. Shafts and pipes twist into the debris. Workers who are standing at their stations 1 second are buried the next, pinned under broken flooring, splintered timber and iron frames too heavy to move by hand. The air fills with dust, pulverized brick, hot vapor, and the harsh metallic smell of ruptured machinery. The violence does not stay inside the factory. The boiler itself blasts out of the structure and travels on, smashing through the engineer's house and driving farther into another home. Gas lines rupture. Fire follows within minutes. Wolf flames begin to move through the wreckage while people are still alive beneath it. Survivors claw through smoke and falling dust, stunned by the roar that gives way to screams, then to the crackle of burning wood and the hiss of escaping gas. Rescue begins almost at once, but the building has already become a trap. By the end of the disaster, 58 people are dead, and 150 are injured. The ruin reaches beyond the factory floor into homes, families, and an entire working community. This is not a random burst of misfortune. It is a preventable disaster born inside an industrial system that treats pressure as routine and workers as expendable. And before the blast becomes memory, the city has already spent years building the conditions that make it possible. Brockton does not grow around steel or coal. It grows around leather, stitching, and the relentless demand for finished shoes. By 1905, the city lives by that trade. Its streets wake early. Its factories draw in men and women before full daylight. Its prosperity rises from benches, cutting tables, sewing machines, freight rooms, and boiler houses hidden behind brick walls and timber frames. The smell of worked leather hangs in the air. So does coal smoke. So does the fine dust of production. This is not a town standing beside industry. This is a town built inside it. R.B. Grover and Company is one of the firms helping drive that prosperity. Its Emerson shoe is sold through 33 retail stores, and demand is strong enough that the company adds an entire 4th floor to its factory in order to produce more. That decision is not made in isolation. It reflects the pressure of a national market that wants goods faster, cheaper, and in greater volume. In February of 1905 alone, Brockton's shoe factories ship nearly 56,000 cases of shoes. The city is producing at a record pace. Output is celebrated. Expansion is praised. A larger building is treated as proof of progress. But industrial progress in this era rests on steam. Steam heats the rooms before dawn, drives systems into readiness, and makes large-scale production possible. A boiler looks static from the outside. It sits low in the building, heavy and enclosed, giving little sign of the force it contains. Yet inside that shell, Water is being heated under pressure until it stores enough energy to tear apart masonry and timber if the vessel fails. That is the contradiction at the center of early industrial America. Prosperity appears calm on the surface while violence waits inside the machinery that sustains it. And this danger is not rare. In 1880 alone, the United States records 159 boiler explosions. In the first decade of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, there are more than 2,000. By 1890, roughly 100,000 boilers are in service across the country. The machine that powers industry is already known to be capable of mass death. Still, the system expands faster than the safeguards around it. Workers understand the need for wages. Families understand the need for regular pay. Entire cities learn to treat risk as part of the morning routine. That is how danger becomes ordinary. That is how a boiler room disappears from public thought until it forces its way back in fire and wreckage. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe. Because these stories are not industrial footnotes, they are the buried structure beneath modern life. And inside that structure, the most dangerous part is often the part no one on the work floor can see. The most dangerous force in the factory does not shout. It sits below the workrooms in iron silence, doing its job so steadily that almost no one upstairs has reason to think about it at all. In the R.B. Grover factory, the morning begins the way industrial mornings are meant to begin. Heat reaches the building before the workday fully settles in. Leather softens enough to handle. Rooms shake lightly with the hum of belts and shafting. Boots cross plank floors. Light comes through tall windows and falls over benches, machines, stacked materials, and rows of labor already taking shape for the day. Nothing about the scene looks violent. It looks organized, useful, profitable. That is part of the deception. A steam boiler is simple in principle and merciless in failure. Water is heated inside a sealed steel vessel until it turns into steam under pressure. That steam can then be carried through pipes to warm rooms or support factory systems. As long as the shell holds, the process appears controlled. But pressure is stored force. It does not need flame in the room above to kill. It only needs one weakness in the metal, one seam that can no longer bear the load, one moment when containment ends. Then heat becomes blast. By 1905, the Grover plant has already been enlarged. A fourth floor is added to answer demand for more production. The building rises because the market wants more shoes more quickly and without interruption. Yet expansion in an industrial system is never only about walls and floor space. It places new demands on heat, on structure, on timing, on the machinery below the visible work. A boiler that once serves one arrangement may now be expected to serve a larger one. The pressure system remains out of sight, but the burden placed upon it grows. For the workers upstairs, none of this is directly measurable. They cannot read a seam by sound. They cannot smell a weakness in riveted steel. They feel only the ordinary signs of a functioning plant. Warmth in the rooms, faint vibration underfoot, the metallic odor of machinery, the dust of leather and work. The factory appears calm because the system is designed to hide the violence it contains until the final second. And beneath that calm sits the oldest industrial lie of all. If the machine is still running, the machine must still be safe. The next act of this disaster begins where the eye fails and the hidden damage starts to speak in ways too few people are willing to hear. The deadliest part of the factory is not the noise. It is the silence inside the metal. On the morning of March 20th, 1905, the R.B. Grover factory is already at work when the first signs of trouble pass through the building in a form easy to dismiss. Around 7:45 a.m., there are reports of strange sounds in radiators along one wall. Not a blast, not a visible rupture, just an irregular knocking, a disturbance in the ordinary language of steam heat. In a factory full of vibration, belts, and iron motion, that kind of sound can be folded into routine and ignored. The chief engineer, Rockwell, is away from the boiler room at that moment. His assistant says everything is in order. Gauges, according to later testimony, appear to show pressure within the safe range. Water level appears proper. To the people on the work floor, the building is still functioning. Warmth rises through the rooms. Machines stand ready. Leather, cloth, timber, gas piping, and iron all remain in their places. The danger stays hidden where the eye cannot reach. That is what makes steam-era failure so merciless. A boiler does not need to look unstable to be close to rupture. The threat can lie inside the shell itself, in a riveted lap seam weakened by age, fatigue, or imperfect construction. A seam is simply where plates of metal are joined together. Under pressure, that joint carries enormous force. If it weakens internally, and the defect may not announce itself clearly through gauges or routine handling, the steel can hold for months, then give way in an instant. The newer boiler at the plant is out for maintenance. The older one is doing the work. Later accounts point toward a hidden flaw in that older unit, not some dramatic act of operator recklessness. The system's weakness is structural, buried in metal and normalized by use. Workers upstairs cannot inspect seam integrity from the cutting room or stitching floor. They cannot smell a crack through coal smoke and hot oil. They feel only the ordinary signs of a functioning plant: heat in the radiators, a faint tremor underfoot, the metallic odor of machines warming into the day. They are asked to trust a system designed so that its greatest danger remains invisible until it becomes fatal. Put it plainly in the comments. When a machine can fail invisibly, after warning signs that sound minor and seem explainable, where does responsibility actually belong? Brockton is not the first place where hidden pressure turns ordinary labor into mass death. It is one more warning in a country already learning the lesson and refusing to keep it. By 1905, the boiler is not an unknown killer. It is a familiar one. The country already has the smoke, the shattered brick, the torn iron, the dead pulled from wreckage, and still the system continues as if each new blast arrives from nowhere. The pattern is already written across decades of industry. In Lower Manhattan in February 1850, the Hague Street explosion destroys a crowded manufacturing building and kills more than 60 people, injuring many more. 15 years later, in April 1865, and the steamboat Sultana erupts near Memphis after a damaged boiler is inadequately repaired and then pushed back into service under extreme load. More than 1,000 die in fire, scalding steam, and the river itself. These are not obscure footnotes. They are public warnings. By 1880 alone, the United States records 159 boiler explosions. In the first 10 years of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, more than 2,000 explosions are counted. The geography changes, the mechanism does not. New York, the Mississippi, Massachusetts, factory floor or river deck, the same industrial logic keeps returning. Pressure is profitable until the vessel fails, and when it fails, ordinary working people absorb the force. The technical problem is brutally simple. A steam boiler stores energy in confined water and vapor. If the shell, seam, or fitting weakens, the release is not gradual like a leaking pipe. It is violent and immediate. Riveted joints split, plates tear apart, pressure becomes blast, steam flashes outward, surrounding structures become fragments. Fire often follows because boilers live inside systems already dense with fuel, gas, timber, oil, cargo, or machinery. Engineers understand these risks in principle. Manufacturers know enough to fear them. Yet warnings remain fragmented, treated as local failures instead of national evidence. That is the deeper negligence. Each disaster is investigated. Each one is mourned. Each one is explained away with narrow language, defective seam, poor maintenance, unusual conditions, bad luck. The dead are counted, but the pattern is not truly confronted. Industry keeps its distance from its own history by pretending repeated failure is coincidence. Workers do not have that luxury. They stand beside the boilers, ride the steamships, heat the factories, and trust systems they do not design and cannot shut down on their own authority. So when Brockton explodes in 1905, it does not stand alone. It enters a long record already blackened by heat, smoke, and ignored instruction. And beyond the boiler room, beyond the work floor itself, there is another truth waiting in plain sight. These plants do not only endanger the people on shift, they endanger the homes built close enough to live by them. The factory does not stand apart from daily life. It stands inside it, close enough that when the boiler fails, the force does not stop at the edge of the workplace. In early 20th century Brockton, industrial growth does not create neat boundaries between labor and home. The shoe trade shapes the streets, the schedules, the rent, and the future of entire families. Workers rise before full light and walk only a short distance to the factory, because that is where the wages are. Houses cluster near mills and workshops because distance costs time and time costs pay. The R.B. Grove. That closeness makes the danger far larger than the boiler room. A steam boiler is a pressure vessel. When it fails, the blast does not remain politely contained inside industrial walls. It becomes kinetic force, flying iron, collapsing timber, shattered glass, and fire fed by broken gas lines. In Brockton, the boiler itself tears out of the factory, smashes through the engineer's house, then drives onward into another dwelling. Nearby buildings ignite. Storehouses burn. A blacksmith shop is consumed. 4 acres of structures are eventually affected. The neighborhood is not adjacent to the disaster. The neighborhood is inside it. For working families, this is the cruelest part of industrial dependence. Home is supposed to be the line between labor and safety. Here, that line barely exists. A man can leave for work and still bring the risk back through the walls of his own street. A wife can be at home and still be struck by the machinery meant to power someone else's shift. Breadwinners vanish. Rent money vanishes with them. Children lose fathers. Wives lose husbands. Injured workers return not to security, but to households already destabilized by low margins and dependence on weekly wages. The air after such a blast is not only full of smoke and dust, it is full of recognition. People understand, all at once, that the factory has never belonged only to those clocking in. It has always held the surrounding community in its radius of danger, and when pressure finally breaks loose, the catastrophe begins to reveal its true scale. It happens faster than thought. 1 second, the factory is a place of work. The next, it is a collapsing machine of fire, iron, and broken timber. At about 7:50 in the morning on March 20th, 1905, the older boiler in the R.B. Grover shoe factory gives way without meaningful warning. There is no long build of visible panic, no dramatic pause in the workrooms above. The force is immediate, the shell fails, pressure escapes at once, and stored energy turns into blast. In simple terms, a steam boiler is water heated inside a sealed vessel until the pressure rises far beyond ordinary atmosphere. When the metal holds, that pressure remains contained. When the shell or seam tears open, the energy does not leak out slowly. It releases almost instantly. Heat, steam, and force expand outward with violent speed. In less than a second, controlled pressure becomes destruction. The boiler punches upward through the building with catastrophic force. Foundations crack, framing gives way, floors drop nearly on top of one another, compressing entire stories into suffocating layers of wreckage only feet apart. Heavy sewing machines, shafting, pipes, benches, and iron fittings plunge with them. Windows burst outward. Brick dust and splintered wood fill the air so densely that the first survivors cannot see more than shapes through the brown-gray cloud. The roar of the explosion is followed by another sound almost as terrible, the groan of a building losing its balance, then the crash of everything falling together. For the workers, there is almost no time to react. Men and women standing at machines are thrown down or buried where they stand. Some are pinned under beams before they understand what has happened. Some are trapped between collapsed floors, pressed into pockets of space that are already filling with dust, smoke, and heat. Others struggle through twisted machinery and shattered timber, trying to find stairways and exits that no longer exist as clear routes. The air turns hot and abrasive. It smells of steam, coal, scorched wood, hot metal, and ruptured gas. Then the fire begins. Broken gas lines feed flames into the wreckage within minutes. What the blast does not crush, the fire begins to claim. The boiler itself does not stop at the roofline. It tears out of the factory, smashes through the engineer's home, then continues into another dwelling beyond, carrying the violence into the neighborhood with it. Inside the ruin, workers who survive the initial collapse now face a second sentence: burning debris above, heavy machines around them, and no clear path to open air. Rescue starts quickly, but physics moves faster than mercy. And as the factory falls in on itself, the destruction stops being local. The blast has already crossed into the streets, the houses, and the rest of Brockton waiting just outside the walls. The boiler does not finish the killing. The fire carries it farther. Within minutes of the explosion, the wrecked factory stops being a collapsed workplace and becomes an open furnace. Broken gas lines hiss through the debris. Flames catch in shattered timber, leather stock, oily machinery, and splintered flooring already packed tight by the collapse. Heat begins to move with ruthless speed through what remains of the R.B. Grover plant. Smoke thickens into a black choking mass. A dust that had filled the air after the blast now mixes with soot and sparks. The smell changes too. First hot metal and steam, then scorched wood, burning leather, gas, and the sickening odor of things that should never be in a fire together. The force has already broken the building open, and that broken structure now helps the flames. Air reaches places it should not. Fire runs through gaps, shafts, and wreckage where workers are still trapped. This is why boiler disasters become compound disasters. The initial rupture destroys containment. The secondary fire exploits it. Once gas pipes are torn apart and burning debris is thrown outward, the event is no longer one failure in one room. It becomes a spreading field of ignition. The destruction moves beyond the factory grounds. The boiler itself has already blasted through the engineer's house and continued roughly 100 feet into another dwelling. Nearby, structures ignite. Storehouses burn. A blacksmith shop is consumed. Homes in Campello are no longer watching the disaster from a distance. They are inside its reach, breathing its smoke, feeling its heat, hearing timbers crack and glass fall into the street. The city is forced to confront a brutal truth. The same industrial density that makes production efficient also makes catastrophe contagious. Firefighters and citizens rush in, but there is no clean line of attack. Rescue and fire suppression are happening at the same time, in the same unstable ruin. Men pull at beams, claw through smoking debris, and listen for voices beneath the crackle of burning wood and the hiss of escaping gas. Some spaces are too hot to enter, some bodies cannot be reached in time, some survivors are trapped close enough to hear rescuers and still impossible to free before the flames overtake them. By the time the fire is brought under control, the disaster is spread across roughly 4 acres of structures. What begins as a boiler rupture has become a neighborhood firestorm. And only when the flames begin to weaken does Brockton fully see what the wreckage has been hiding beneath it. When the fire weakens enough for men to enter the ruin in earnest, the scale of the killing becomes impossible to soften. The factory is quieter now, but it is the wrong kind of quiet. Beneath the drifting smoke and wet ash, beneath blackened beams and bent machinery, the dead are still being found. By the end of the disaster, 58 people are dead and around 150 are injured. The number is terrible on its own, but the wreckage refuses to leave the dead as numbers. Recovery crews move through layers of collapsed floors packed almost flat, where sewing machines, shafting, pipes, timbers, and bodies have been driven together by the force of the blast. Some victims are reached quickly. Others are found only after hours of cutting, lifting, and digging through hot debris that still throws off heat and the smell of soaked ash, burned leather, scorched wood, and ruined iron. In some places, the fire has done such damage that identification becomes uncertain or impossible. That is one of the cruelest truths of industrial fire after structural collapse. The blast kills many immediately, but the fire erases names. The dead are not one class of worker or one age of labor. Or they are men and women who come in for a morning shift and do not come home. Some are experienced hands. Some are newer to the factory. Some have families already depending on that week's wages. Others are themselves the sons and daughters of working households held together by narrow margins. The injured do not escape cleanly either. Burns, crush injuries, fractures, and smoke damage follow them out of the ruin and into lives that are suddenly uncertain. A worker who survives may still lose a livelihood. A household may still lose its stability. For the city, grief becomes practical as well as emotional. There are funerals to arrange, bodies to identify, children to support, rent to pay, and families to steady after the wage earner is dead or maimed. Some remains cannot be individually named and are buried together, or a public acknowledgement of how completely the factory and fire have taken hold of human bodies. The community does what working communities always do. It gathers money, labor, and care where the system has failed to provide protection. But even in mourning, another process is already beginning. Officials will now step into the wreckage looking for causes, and what they choose to see, or refuse to see, will decide whether the dead become a warning or merely a record. After the smoke lifts, the language changes. Fire becomes evidence. Death becomes testimony. The wreckage that still smells of wet ash, hot metal, gas, and burned leather is now entered not only by rescuers, but by officials, engineers, lawyers, and men tasked with deciding what this disaster is allowed to mean. In the days that follow the destruction of the R.B. Grover Factory, the investigation begins with the boiler itself. That is understandable. A pressure vessel has failed, and a failed pressure vessel leaves behind visible metal, torn seams, broken plates, and shattered fittings that can be examined. Investigators look for the initiating defect, the first break in the chain. The conclusion that begins to take shape is narrow and technically plausible. The older boiler appears to have suffered from a hidden weakness, likely in a riveted lap seam, a joint where iron plates overlap and are fastened together. Under steam pressure, that seam carries immense force. If the metal has aged, fatigued, or developed an internal flaw, the rupture can come suddenly even when gauges and water levels appear normal. In that limited sense, the inquiry identifies a cause. But identifying the first failure is not the same as confronting the full system that turns one rupture into mass death. The investigation moves toward the language institutions prefer when industry is implicated, but structure itself is left standing. Hidden defect, undiscoverable flaw, no clear criminal blame, no deliberate misconduct. The boiler becomes the culprit because the boiler is convenient. It cannot defend itself. It cannot point back at production pressure, at the continued use of older equipment, at the enlargement of a factory whose supporting systems may no longer match its demands, at building methods that allow collapse and fire to kill so many so quickly, or at a wider industrial culture already saturated with boiler warnings and still willing to proceed. For workers and families, that narrowing is its own kind of violence. The people buried in the wreckage are not killed by abstract metallurgy alone. They are killed by a system that accepts too many layered vulnerabilities in one place and calls that arrangement normal until bodies force a public reckoning. Yet the official response often searches for a single broken part, because a single broken part is easier to file, easier to close, and easier to survive politically than a condemnation of the whole operating culture. So the investigation advances, but it does not go far enough. It finds the torn metal. It does not fully name the thinking that kept such risk in service. And once that failure of vision settles into the record, the deeper question begins to press harder than ever. Why does this keep happening at all? The most revealing part of a preventable disaster is not the explosion. It is what the system has already decided it can live with before the explosion ever comes. By the early 20th century, the boiler is not mysterious. Its danger is well understood by engineers, insurers, factory owners, and anyone who has read the long record of shattered buildings and scalded bodies. Steam power is useful precisely because it stores enormous force inside a sealed vessel. That force can heat a factory, drive production, and keep a workday moving with mechanical regularity. But if the shell weakens, if a seam fails, if inspection is poor, or if old equipment is kept in service beyond prudence, the same force becomes blast. The principle is not complicated. Pressure must be controlled, monitored, relieved, and respected. The problem is that respect costs money. Stopping production costs money. Replacing older boilers costs money. Independent inspection costs money. Safer construction, redundancy, better valves, stronger codes, and the right to shut a system down when something feels wrong all cost money. Against that stands the culture of industrial urgency, orders waiting to be filled, markets to satisfy, payroll to meet, investors to reassure, schedules to protect. In that arithmetic, danger becomes negotiable until it turns fatal. The people making those calculations are rarely the ones standing on wooden floors above the boiler room, breathing coal smoke and machine oil, feeling the faint vibration under their boots, trusting a pressure vessel they did not choose and cannot meaningfully refuse. That imbalance is the heart of the system. The workers depend on wages. Their families depend on those wages. A city built on factories depends on uninterrupted output. That dependence strips ordinary labor of real power. A stitcher, cutter, engineer, or fireman may suspect trouble, hear an unfamiliar sound, notice a tremor, smell hot metal, or sense that the machinery is not right. But suspicion is not authority. In too many industrial settings, the worker closest to the hazard is the person least empowered to halt it. This is how repeated boiler catastrophes become something worse than technical failures. They become evidence of a culture willing to let known dangers remain in service because reform is slower than profit and cheaper than replacement, until the dead make delay impossible to defend. I'll put it plainly in the comments. When an industry knows its machinery can kill on this scale and still tolerates weak safeguards, is that negligence merely oversight, or is it policy by habit? And once that question is asked honestly, the final measure of Brockton is no longer only how people died there, but what the living are finally forced to change in response. The law comes after the funerals. It comes after the smoke thins, after the timbers cool, after the dead are counted, and the city has already learned what unchecked pressure does to a working community. Brockton's destruction does not remain only a local grief. It helps force a wider recognition that steam power cannot be left to custom, optimism, and uneven judgment. A boiler is not just a furnace with iron walls. It is a vessel holding compressed energy, and compressed energy demands rules strong enough to stand between ordinary labor and sudden mass death. Without standards for construction, inspection, fittings, water level, safety valves, and certified working pressure, every factory that depends on steam is asking workers to trust machinery that may already be failing in silence. In the years after the Grover disaster, Massachusetts moves toward stricter boiler oversight. By 1907, the state establishes requirements for inspection and for operation within certified safe limits. A board of boiler rules is created to shape standards that industry has been too willing to delay on its own. That process matters because it marks a shift in responsibility. Safety is no longer treated merely as the private concern of owners, operators, or insurers. It becomes a matter of public law. The state steps in because the cost of leaving things as they are has already been written in burned buildings, buried workers, and families pushed into hardship. The change does not come from sudden moral clarity. It comes from accumulated failure. Brockton joins a longer chain of boiler disasters that finally makes denial harder to maintain. The same pressure that drives production has also driven lawmakers, engineers, and reformers toward a more disciplined system. From these state-level reforms, the larger code movement grows, leading toward the ASME, Boiler and Pressure Vessel Code in the next decade. That code is not born in abstraction. It is born in wreckage. For workers, that legacy is the only form of justice history sometimes offers too late. The dead do not return. The families do not recover what was taken from them in full. But the disaster leaves behind a hard lesson. Machinery that can kill on this scale cannot be governed by convenience. It must be governed by design, inspection, and the right to stop before warning becomes catastrophe. If this story stays with you, remember what Brockton demands to be remembered for. Not spectacle, not nostalgia, a memorial, and a warning that does not expire.